Well, hello, it's Gordon Clark with the Province Newspaper. I'm here today, very honored to have Perry Bellegarde, the National Chief of the Assembly First Nations. He's here at the Province today talking about a major theme, closing the gap. Perry, tell me, what is the gap, and what do we do about it, and why is it important?
All right. Well, thanks for the opportunity to be here, Gord. And the gap that I continue to talk about and refer to is that, according to the United Nations Human Development Index, Canada is rated 6th in terms of quality of life, very up high. It's a great place, beautiful country. But when you apply the indices, those same indices to Indigenous peoples, we're 63rd. So it's 6th versus 63rd. And that gap represents so many things that aren't in the best interest of our people or Canada as a country. It represents the cap on education. It represents the 132 communities that have boil water advisories. It represents the high youth suicide rates. It represents the 40,000 kids in foster care. It represents the 1,200 missing emerging Indigenous women and girls. It represents all those negative stats. And that's why we say it's in the best interest of this country to make key strategic investments now in education and training, in housing, and access to potable water, because that gap will close. And then when that closes, First Nations people aren't the only ones that win. The country will win, because the high social cost of maintaining the gap will close. And that's really in the best interest of this country.
Now, during the interview in there, you were talking about the figures. You'll have to remind me again, because I didn't jot them down. But you were talking about, had there been some investment some years back, we would have had this massive increase in GDP. I think you said $400 billion in GDP. That's a huge number.
That's how it should be viewed. Like, if 5 years ago, investments in education, for example, the on-reserve tuition per child is $6,000 per child.
Right.
In provincial school systems, it's almost $11,000 per child. Oh. In the French school systems, it's almost $20,000 per child. So if investments were made to close that fiscal gap, 5 years ago, you would have, in a positive way, approximately $400 billion in GDP in a positive growth, by 2026. And as well, you would also save $117 billion in social spending, if investments were made. And
this is from lifting Native people
just from from closing the gap.
Right, participating better economically.
Exactly, right. Because how else do you alleviate poverty but other than a good education? And so it's like, it should be viewed as not as expenditures, but as investments, investing in human capital, because we have the fastest growing segment of Canada's population, young First Nations men and women. And so it should be viewed as investing in human capital, invest in the labor pool. And that's what it should be.
Now, we're in the middle of a national federal election.
Yes, October 19th.
And these are issues, and we're just coming off of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report and those sorts of things. You don't hear a lot of this on the campaign trail. I mean, you do. It must be a bit discouraging.
It is discouraging, but I'm going to be remaining forever hopeful that people get it. Canadians are great people. They're fair, open-minded people. And I always say, once they become educated and aware of these issues, that will lead to understanding, and that will lead to action. So Canadians as a group will say, hey, future member of parliament, you need to address First Nations issues, because that's really in the best interest of this country. How are you planning on closing the gap and making key strategic investments, a new fiscal framework, recognition for Aboriginal rights and title? It's not the great focus, but I'm forever hopeful that through these cross-Canada speaking tours, speaking at universities, getting out to media, that there's a greater awareness about the need to close the gap, because when that gap closes, First Nations aren't the only ones to win. Canada as a country will win, and that's the message we're trying to get out there, and to future prime ministers on October 19th. That's what we're trying to get out to them.